The year is 1521. Ferdinand Magellan steps onto the shores of the Philippines, believing he's discovered a new world, but instead of empty lands, he found thriving kingdoms, trading with China, crafting gold, and ruling through diplomacy. This is not just another tale of colonization, it's the story of a people who resisted conquest and shaped one of the most dramatic legacies in the world history.
The year is 1521, and a Spanish explorer named Ferdinand Magellan steps onto the shores of what would become known as the Philippines. He believes he's discovered a new world, but little does he know he's actually encountering one of Southeast Asia's most complex and ancient civilizations. What happens next will shock you, because this isn't just another story of European colonization. This is the incredible tale of a nation that refused to be conquered, a people who survived 400 years of foreign rule, and an archipelago that would become the stage for some of the most dramatic moments in world history. Welcome back to the channel, history lovers. Today we're diving deep into the fascinating story of the Philippines, a nation of over 7,000 islands that has experienced more cultural transformations than almost any other country on Earth. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the Philippines is called the melting pot of Asia, how a single moment of defiance changed the course of World War II in the Pacific, and why this small island nation became the birthplace of the world's first global revolution against colonialism. But first, let me tell you something that will completely change how you think about Filipino history. Most people believe the story begins with Magellan's arrival, but that's like saying American history started with Christopher Columbus. The truth is far more fascinating and complex. Long before any Europeans set foot on Filipino soil, these islands were home to sophisticated kingdoms that traded with China, established diplomatic relations with neighboring empires, and developed writing systems that scholars are still decoding today. The Laguna copperplate inscription, discovered in 1989, proves that by 900 AD, the Philippines had a complex society with its own legal system, debt forgiveness practices, and international trade networks. Picture this. While Europe was struggling through the Dark Ages, Filipino kingdoms like Manila, Tondo, and Cebu were thriving commercial centers. Ships from China, India, and the Malay kingdoms regularly docked at Filipino ports, bringing silk, spices, and precious metals. The rulers of these kingdoms weren't primitive chieftains. They were sophisticated political leaders who understood diplomacy, economics, and statecraft. The Rajanat of Manila, located in what is now Manila, controlled crucial river systems and trade routes. Its ruler, Raja Suleiman, commanded respect from neighboring kingdoms and maintained a powerful fleet that protected merchant vessels from pirates. Meanwhile, in the Visayas, the Kingdom of Cebu under Raja Humabon had established itself as a major player in the regional spice trade. These weren't isolated villages living in the Stone Age. Archaeological evidence shows that pre-colonial Filipinos had developed advanced metallurgy, creating intricate gold jewelry that rivals anything produced in contemporary Europe. The Surigao treasure, discovered in the 1980s, contains gold artifacts so sophisticated that experts initially questioned their authenticity. But here's where the story takes its first dramatic turn. In March 1521, 3 Spanish ships appeared on the horizon near the island of Homonhon. Ferdinand Magellan, leading what he believed would be the final leg of the first circumnavigation of the globe, was desperately seeking supplies in safe harbor. His crew was decimated by scurvy, his ships were barely seaworthy, and he was racing against time to find the legendary Spice Islands. What happened next reveals the complex political landscape of the Philippines. Magellan didn't arrive as a conqueror with overwhelming force. He came as a desperate explorer with a small, weakened fleet. His success in the Philippines wasn't due to military superiority, but rather his ability to navigate the intricate web of inter-island rivalries and politics.
In March 1521, Magellan's weary fleet staggered into Cebu. Welcomed by Raja Humabon, he thought he had secured dominance. But when he tried to subdue Datu Lapu-Lapu of Mactan, everything changed. On April 27, Lapu-Lapu and 1,500 warriors crushed Magellan's forces in the shallows, proving that European steel and gunpowder couldn't guarantee victory. It was the first act of defiance that echoed through centuries of resistance.
When Magellan arrived in Cebu, Raja Humabon welcomed him not as subjects would welcome a master, but as one ruler greeting another. The Spanish offered alliance, military support against rival kingdoms, and access to European trade goods. In return, Humabon agreed to convert to Christianity and allow Spanish missionaries to operate in his territory. But Magellan made a fatal miscalculation. Drunk on his early diplomatic successes, he began to believe his own propaganda about European superiority. When Datu Lapu-Lapu of Mactan Island refused to submit to Spanish authority, Magellan decided to make an example of him. The Battle of Mactan on April 27, 1521, became one of the most significant moments in Filipino history. Lapu-Lapu, commanding roughly 1,500 warriors armed with traditional weapons, faced off against Magellan's force of 60 Spaniards equipped with guns, crossbows, and steel armor. According to Spanish chronicler Antonio Pigafetta, the battle was a complete disaster for the Europeans. Magellan's forces became bogged down in the shallow waters near Mactan's shore. Their guns and crossbows, devastating in open combat, proved ineffective against warriors who knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. Lapu-Lapu's fighters used hit-and-run tactics, overwhelming the Spanish with sheer numbers and superior knowledge of local conditions. When the smoke cleared, Ferdinand Magellan lay dead on the beach, along with 8 of his men. The survivors fled to their ships, and within days they had sailed away from the Philippines entirely. Lapu-Lapu had achieved something remarkable. He had defeated the first European expedition to reach the Philippines, proving that advanced technology alone couldn't guarantee colonialism. But this victory was only the beginning of a much longer and more complex story. The Spanish didn't abandon their dreams of controlling the Philippines. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi returned with a larger, better organized expedition. This time, the Spanish employed a different strategy entirely. Instead of relying purely on military conquest, Legazpi used a combination of diplomacy, religious conversion, and strategic alliances with local rulers. The Spanish introduced a system called encomienda, which granted Spanish colonists control over specific territories and the right to collect tribute from local populations. In exchange, the colonists were supposed to provide protection and religious instruction. The transformation of Filipino society under Spanish rule was both dramatic and gradual. The Spanish imposed their legal system, their religion, their language, and their social hierarchies. They built churches, established schools, and created new administrative centers. Cities like Manila, Cebu, and Iloilo grew into major commercial hubs that connected the Philippines to the global Spanish Empire. But here's what makes Filipino colonial history unique. The people never stopped resisting. Unlike other colonized regions where resistance was sporadic and localized, the Philippines experienced continuous, organized opposition to Spanish rule for over 300 years. From the Dagami Revolt in 1567 to the Silong Rebellion in 1762, Filipino leaders consistently challenged Spanish authority. The most famous of these early revolts was led by Francisco Dagohoy in Bohol, who maintained an independent kingdom in the island's interior for 85 years. Think about that for a moment. While the Spanish claimed to control the Philippines, a significant portion of one major island remained completely outside their authority for nearly a century. The Spanish colonial period also saw the emergence of a unique Filipino identity. The constant interaction between Spanish, Chinese, and indigenous cultures created something entirely new. The Filipino language incorporated thousands of Spanish words, but maintained its fundamental Malayo-Polynesian structure. Catholic Christianity became deeply rooted in Filipino culture, but it blended with traditional beliefs and practices in ways that created distinctly Filipino forms of worship. By the 19th century, this cultural synthesis had produced a new class of educated Filipinos who began to question Spanish rule from within the system itself. These ilustrados, or enlightened ones, had been educated in European universities and were deeply influenced by the liberal ideas sweeping through Europe and the Americas. The most famous of these ilustros was José Rizal, whose novels Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo exposed the corruption and brutality of Spanish colonial administration. Rizal didn't advocate violent revolution, but his writings inspired a generation of Filipino intellectuals to dream of independence. However, it was Andrés Bonifacio who transformed intellectual resistance into armed revolution. In 1892, he founded the Katipunan, a secret society dedicated to overthrowing Spanish rule through violent means. The Katipunan used traditional Filipino kinship networks and indigenous organizational structures to build a revolutionary movement that eventually encompassed thousands of members across Luzon. When the Philippine Revolution began in 1896, it caught the Spanish completely off guard. They had assumed that their control was secure, that the Ilustrados would remain loyal, and that any resistance would be limited and easily suppressed. Instead, they faced a coordinated uprising that demonstrated remarkable strategic sophistication. The revolution's early success was largely due to the leadership of men like Emilio Aguinaldo, who understood both traditional Filipino warfare and modern military tactics. Aguinaldo's forces used guerrilla strategies that maximized their advantages while minimizing Spanish strengths. They avoided pitched battles where Spanish firepower would be decisive, instead focusing on hit-and-run attacks that disrupted supply lines and demoralized enemy forces. But just as the revolution seemed to be gaining momentum, everything changed. The Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, and suddenly the Philippines found itself at the center of a global conflict between two foreign powers. The Americans, led by Admiral George Dewey, destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1, 1898. Effectively ending Spanish naval power in the Pacific. Initially, many Filipinos welcomed the Americans as liberators. Aguinaldo believed that the United States would honor Filipino independence and help establish a democratic republic. The Filipino revolutionaries even cooperated with American forces in the final assault on Spanish positions in Manila. However, the Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, revealed American intentions. Instead of granting independence, the United States purchased the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. The Filipinos, who had been fighting for independence for over 2 years, suddenly found themselves with a new colonial master. What followed was one of the most brutal conflicts in American military history. The Philippine-American War, which lasted from 1899 to 1902, involved tactics that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. American forces employed concentration camps, torture, and collective punishment in their efforts to suppress Filipino resistance. The Americans called it a pacification campaign, but it was really a war of conquest that cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives. General Jacob Smith infamously ordered his troops to turn the island of Samar into a howling wilderness, killing everyone over the age of 10. The water cure, a form of torture where prisoners were forced to drink massive quantities of water before having it expelled by force, became a standard interrogation technique. Despite this brutality, the Americans also introduced significant reforms that would have lasting impacts on Filipino society. They established a public education system that dramatically increased literacy rates. They built roads, bridges, and harbors that improved transportation and communication. They introduced modern medical practices that reduced disease and increased life expectancy. Perhaps most importantly, the Americans introduced democratic institutions and encouraged Filipino participation in government. By the 1930s, the Philippines had achieved Commonwealth status and was on a clear path toward independence. Filipino politicians like Manuel Quezon and Sergio Osmeña had gained significant experience in democratic governance and had built political parties that represented different segments of Filipino society. But independence would have to wait. On December 7, 1941, just hours after attacking Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces began their invasion of the Philippines. The Philippines suddenly found itself at the epicenter of World War II in the Pacific. And what happened next would determine not just the fate of the islands, but the entire course of the Pacific War. The Japanese invasion was swift and overwhelming. Within weeks, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur had been forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. The siege of Bataan lasted for months, with defenders facing starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. When they finally surrendered in April 1942, 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners were forced to march 65 miles to prison camps in what became known as the Bataan Death March. Thousands died during this march, victims of Japanese brutality, exhaustion, and disease. Those who survived faced years of imprisonment under horrific conditions. The Bataan Death March became a symbol of Japanese war crimes and steeled American resolve to retake the Philippines at any cost. But the Japanese occupation wasn't just a military conquest. It was a systematic attempt to remake Filipino society. The Japanese promoted the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, claiming they were liberating Asia from Western colonialism. They established a puppet government under Jose Laurel and attempted to win Filipino support by promising independence and economic development. However, Japanese rule proved even more brutal than American colonialism. The Japanese military government implemented forced labor programs, appropriated food supplies for their own use, and treated Filipino civilians with contempt and violence. Resistance groups formed almost immediately, and by 1943, guerrilla warfare had spread throughout the archipelago. The Filipino guerrilla movement during World War II was perhaps the most effective resistance operation in the entire Pacific theater. Led by men like Colonel Wendell Fertig and Luis Taruc, these guerrillas established parallel governments in liberated territories, maintained communication networks that provided intelligence to Allied forces, and carried out sabotage operations that significantly hampered Japanese military effectiveness. When MacArthur returned to the Philippines in October 1944, he found a population that had already begun liberating itself. The guerrillas controlled large portions of the countryside and provided crucial support for the American landing at Leyte. The subsequent battles to retake the Philippines were among the largest and most costly of the Pacific War, but they also demonstrated the remarkable resilience and fighting spirit of the Filipino people. The Battle of Manila in February and March 1945 was particularly devastating. Japanese forces, unable to defend the city against the advancing Americans and Filipinos, decided to destroy it rather than surrender it intact. The resulting urban warfare turned Manila into a battlefield where civilians became primary targets. By the time the fighting ended, over 100,000 Filipino civilians had died, making Manila the second most devastated city of World War II after Warsaw. Despite this destruction, the Philippines emerged from the war with a stronger sense of national identity and a clear commitment to independence. On July 4, 1946, the Republic of the Philippines was officially established with Manuel Roxas as its first president. After more than 400 years of foreign rule, the Filipino people had finally achieved their dream of independence. But independence brought new challenges. The country's infrastructure was devastated, its economy was in ruins, and its political system was dominated by elite families who had collaborated with various colonial regimes. The Hukbalahap Rebellion, led by former anti-Japanese guerrillas, challenged the new government's legitimacy and demanded more radical social and economic reforms. The early decades of independence were marked by political instability, economic dependence on the United States, and growing social inequality. Despite having democratic institutions, real power remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite who used their wealth and connections to maintain control over land, businesses, and political positions. This situation reached a crisis point during the presidency of Ferdinand Marcos, who was first elected in 1965. Initially, Marcos was seen as a dynamic leader who could modernize the Philippines and reduce its dependence on foreign powers. However, his administration became increasingly corrupt and authoritarian, culminating in the declaration of martial law in 1972. For 14 years, the Philippines lived under martial law, with Marcos ruling as a dictator who suspended democratic institutions, imprisoned political opponents, and allowed his family and cronies to plunder the national treasury. The Marcos regime became synonymous with corruption, human rights abuses, and economic mismanagement on a massive scale. However, the Filipino people's long tradition of resistance didn't disappear under martial law. Opposition groups, ranging from communist guerrillas to middle-class professionals, continued to challenge Marcos's authority. The assassination of opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr. in 1983 sparked widespread protests that eventually grew into a national movement demanding Marcos's removal from power. The People Power Revolution of 1986 was the culmination of this resistance movement. When Marcos attempted to steal the presidential election from Corazon Aquino, millions of Filipinos took to the streets in peaceful protest. The images of nuns placing flowers in the barrels of soldiers' guns, of ordinary citizens standing in front of tanks, and of an entire nation refusing to accept electoral fraud captured the world's imagination. The revolution succeeded without a single shot being fired. Marcos fled to Hawaii, and Corazon Aquino became president of a restored democracy. The People Power Revolution inspired similar movements around the world and proved that ordinary citizens could overthrow authoritarian regimes through peaceful means. Since 1986, the Philippines has maintained democratic institutions despite facing numerous challenges, including military coups, natural disasters, economic crises, and ongoing insurgencies. The country has produced leaders like Fidel Ramos, who helped stabilize the economy and strengthen democratic institutions, and others who have struggled with corruption and ineffective governance. Today, the Philippines stands as a middle-income country with a growing economy, a vibrant civil society, and strong democratic traditions. Its overseas Filipino workers have become a global phenomenon, with Filipino nurses, domestic workers, and professionals working in countries around the world and sending billions of dollars home in remittances. The story of the Philippines is ultimately a story of resilience, adaptation, and the unbreakable human spirit. From the ancient kingdoms that traded with Asia's great empires through centuries of colonial rule to the modern democratic republic, the Filipino people have consistently demonstrated their ability to survive, resist, and ultimately triumph over adversity. This is a nation that defeated the first European expedition to reach its shores, maintained continuous resistance to colonial rule for over 400 years, survived one of the most brutal occupations of World War II, overthrew a dictatorship through peaceful means, and continues to play an important role in regional and global affairs. The Philippines today faces new challenges, from climate change to economic inequality to regional security threats. But if history is any guide, the Filipino people will meet these challenges with the same creativity, determination, and resilience that has characterized their entire historical experience.
From Lapu-Lapu's victory to the People's Power Revolution, the Philippines has defied empires, endured war, and toppled dictators. This nation of resilience transformed foreign rule into a legacy of survival and freedom. And today, it continues to shape Asia and the world. If this story inspired you, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join us as we uncover more untold chapters of history. Until next time, keep exploring the echoes of the past. Thank you.